Mariana sold her daughter for money. What happened to her months later left her begging for forgiveness. The sound of a pot crashing to the floor echoed through the small kitchen, followed by the inconsolable cries of a baby. Mariana, nerves frayed, rushed to clean up the mess while trying to soothe her youngest child. "For God's sake, Mariana, can't you do anything right?" Roberto's voice boomed from the next room. "I'm sorry, honey, it slipped from my hands. I'll clean it up," she replied, her voice trembling. Roberto entered the kitchen, his face contorted in a grimace of disgust. "And what are we going to eat now? That was the last can we had." Mariana, baby in arms, looked at the spilled contents on the floor. Beans, their dinner for that night, now inedible. We can eat bread," she suggested timidly. "Bread? Again?" Roberto kicked a chair, sending it crashing to the floor. The baby wailed louder. "I'm sick of living like this. Sick!" At that moment, the front door opened, and 15-year-old Lucia, their eldest daughter, walked in. Her face lit up at the sight of her family, but she quickly noticed the tension in the air. "What's wrong? Why is Juanito crying?" she asked, approaching her mother to stroke the baby's head. Roberto glared at her bitterly. "Your mother just threw our dinner on the floor." "That happens, Papa. It was an accident." "Don't be so hard on Mama," Lucia frowned. "Hard? You think I'm being hard?" Roberto laughed humorlessly. "Hard is living in this dump. Hard is not knowing if we'll have anything to eat tomorrow. Hard is—" "Enough!" Mariana interrupted, a force in her voice that surprised everyone, even herself. "Lucia, honey, take your brother to the room, please." The young girl nodded, taking the baby from her mother's arms. Before leaving, she looked at her father with a mixture of sadness and reproach. Once alone, Mariana faced her husband. "Roberto, I understand your frustration. I feel it too, but yelling at each other isn't going to solve anything." The man slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "What do you want me to do, Mariana? I've looked for work everywhere. Nobody wants to hire a 45-year-old man with no education." Mariana knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "I know, my love, but we can't lose hope. For the children." Roberto looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm scared, Mariana. Scared of failing them, of not being able to give them what they deserve." "You're not failing them," she whispered, caressing his cheek. "You're a good father." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of footsteps. Lucia appeared at the kitchen door, her expression serious. "Papa, Mama, I have something to tell you." Both parents looked at her expectantly. I've decided to quit school," Lucia blurted out, avoiding their gazes. "What?" Mariana exclaimed, standing up. "No, Lucia, you can't do that." "It's the only way I can help," the young girl replied, her chin set with determination. "I can work. Bring money to the house." Roberto slowly stood up, approaching his daughter. "Lucia, I appreciate what you want to do, but your education is the most important thing." "More important than eating?" she retorted, tears welling up in her eyes. "More important than Juanito's future?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. Finally, Mariana spoke. "Let's eat dinner. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Dinner was a silent and tense affair, stale bread and water. No one dared complain. That night, while everyone slept, Roberto snuck out of the house. He walked through the dark streets of the neighborhood, his mind a whirlwind of desperate thoughts. Without realizing it, his steps led him to the corner bar. The place was almost empty, except for a couple of drunks at a table and the bartender wiping down glasses. "Give me the strongest thing you've got," Roberto mumbled, sitting at the bar. The bartender, a burly middle-aged man, eyed him curiously. "Rough night, friend?" Roberto laughed bitterly. "Rough life, I'd say." The bartender poured a glass of amber liquid and slid it towards him. "On the house, looks like you need it." Roberto grabbed the glass and downed it in one gulp, feeling the burn in his throat. "Thanks." "You want to talk about it?" the bartender offered. For a moment, Roberto considered telling him to go to hell, but something in the man's sympathetic gaze made him talk. "I have a family to feed, and I can't do it," he confessed, his voice breaking. "My oldest daughter wants to quit school to work, and I feel like a failure." The bartender nodded, pouring him another drink. Tough times, eh? But hey, at least you have a family that loves you. What good is love when your children are hungry? Roberto retorted. Love doesn't fill stomachs. That's the truth. A gravelly voice joined the conversation. Roberto turned to see one of the men from the table approaching. Even though his clothes were wrinkled, they appeared to be of good quality. But money does, the stranger continued, sitting heavily beside Roberto. And I know ways to get it. The bartender frowned. Careful what you say, Ernesto. I don't want any trouble in my bar. Ernesto waved a dismissive hand. Relax, old man. Just having a friendly chat with… What was your name again, friend? Roberto, he replied, intrigued despite himself. Roberto, Ernesto repeated, clapping him on the back. Tell me, Roberto, how far would you go for your family? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Roberto glanced at his empty glass, then back at Ernesto. I'd do anything for them. A crooked smile spread across Ernesto's face. That's just what I wanted to hear. See, I represent certain people who are always looking for talent. What kind of talent? Roberto asked, his heart quickening. Ernesto leaned in, lowering his voice. People willing to do special jobs. Nothing illegal, I assure you, but morally questionable to some. The bartender intervened. Roberto, don't listen to this guy. Whatever it is, it's not worth it. But Roberto was already hooked. Tell me more. Ernesto grinned, pulling a card from his pocket. Let's talk somewhere more private. Call me tomorrow if you're interested. Roberto took the card, its weight feeling like lead. The next day, the tension in the house was palpable. Lucia was getting ready for school, her backpack lighter than usual. Are you sure about this, honey? Mariana asked, adjusting her daughter's collar. Lucia nodded, her eyes determined. Yes, Mama. I've made up my mind. I'll talk to the principal today. Roberto, who had been unusually quiet all morning, approached them. Wait, Lucia. Don't go to school today. Both of them stared at him, surprised. Why, Papa? Lucia asked. Roberto took a deep breath. Because I think I've found a solution to our problems. Mariana eyed him suspiciously. What are you talking about, Roberto? What did you do last night? He avoided her gaze. I met someone who can help us. Help us how? Mariana pressed. Roberto pulled out the card Ernesto had given him. This man, he says he represents people with money, people looking for individuals for special jobs. Lucia frowned. What kind of jobs, Papa? I don't know exactly, Roberto admitted, but they pay well, very well. Mariana snatched the card from him, reading it with disbelief. Family Solutions? Roberto, this sounds suspicious. It's an opportunity, he exclaimed. Our only opportunity. No, Mariana said firmly. We don't know who these people are or what they want. It's dangerous. Roberto slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone. And what do you suggest? That we stay here, watching our children starve. Papa, calm down, Lucia intervened, putting a hand on his arm. He shrugged her off, turning away. No, Lucia, I'm tired of calming down, of settling. This is our chance to change things. Roberto, please, Mariana pleaded. Think about what you're saying. But Roberto had already made up his mind. Without another word, he grabbed the card and stormed out of the house, leaving his family in stunned silence. He walked through the neighborhood streets, his mind a jumble of conflicting thoughts. Part of him knew Mariana was right, that this was dangerous and suspicious, but the desperation, the hunger, the shame of not being able to provide for his family, it all outweighed the risks. Before he realized it, he was dialing the number on the card. Hello? A voice answered on the other end. Hi, it's Roberto. We met last night at the bar. There was a pause. Ah, Roberto, glad you called. Ready to talk business? Roberto swallowed hard. Yes, I am. Excellent. Meet me in an hour at the address on the card. The call ended, leaving Roberto with a mixture of anticipation and dread. An hour later, he stood before an office building in the city center. Nothing fancy, but definitely out of his usual league. In the reception area, an elegant woman greeted him in the office building's reception area. Mr. Roberto, Mr. Ernesto is expecting you. Right this way, please. She led him down a hallway to an office at the end. Ernesto was waiting for him, seated behind a mahogany desk. "Roberto, my friend, have a seat," Ernesto said, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Roberto sat down, feeling out of place in the luxurious surroundings. "Well," Ernesto began, clasping his hands on the desk, "let's get down to business. I have a proposition for you, one that could change your life and your family's life forever." Roberto leaned forward. "I'm listening." Ernesto smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "You see, I represent a very wealthy family. They have everything money can buy, except for one thing, a child." Roberto blinked, confused. "I don't understand. Do they want to adopt?" "Not exactly," Ernesto replied. "They want to buy." The silence that followed was deafening. Roberto felt as if the air had grown thick, making it difficult to breathe. "Buy?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Buy," Ernesto confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "A son, your son, to be specific." Roberto shot to his feet, the chair clattering behind him. "Are you crazy? How dare you even suggest such a thing?" "Sit down, Roberto," Ernesto said calmly. "Hear me out before you make a decision." "There's nothing to hear," Roberto retorted, heading for the door. "This is insane. 50 million, Ernesto blurted out. Roberto stopped, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" 50 million, Ernesto repeated. "That's what they're willing to pay. Think about it, Roberto. You'd never have to worry about money again. You could give your family the life they deserve." Roberto slowly turned, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "You're talking about selling my son. How can you even suggest such a thing?" Ernesto leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Don't think of it as selling, Roberto. Think of it as giving your son an opportunity you could never offer him otherwise. An opportunity." Roberto's voice trembled. "What kind of opportunity is it to grow up away from his family?" "The opportunity to never go hungry," Ernesto replied calmly. "To have the best education, the best doctors, a secure future. Isn't that what every parent wants for their children?" Roberto leaned against the wall, feeling like his legs might give way at any moment. But he's my son. My baby." Ernesto stood up and approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And he always will be. No one can change that. But think about your eldest daughter, your wife. Don't they also deserve a better life?" Tears started to roll down Roberto's cheeks. I can't do this." "Take your time," Ernesto said, returning to his desk. "Think about it. Talk to your wife if you want. But remember, this offer won't be on the table forever." Roberto left the office in a daze, barely aware of his surroundings. He walked aimlessly through the city streets, his mind replaying the conversation with Ernesto over and over again. When he finally reached home, it was already dark. Mariana was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face etched with worry. "Roberto, where have you been? I was so worried." He looked at her, unable to form words. Mariana approached him, taking his face in her hands. "What happened? What did those people say to you?" Roberto broke down, falling to his knees. Mariana embraced him, confused and frightened. "Please, Roberto, talk to me. What's going on?" Between sobs, Roberto began to tell her everything. The offer, the money, what it would mean for them. With each word, he felt like he was tearing himself apart. Mariana listened in silence, her face shifting from disbelief to horror. "No," she finally said, her voice firm. "No, Roberto, we can't do this. He's our son." I know," Roberto cried. "But think about the future we could give Lucia, how we could get out of this misery." Mariana pulled away from him, as if his touch burned. "How can you even consider it? What kind of parents would we be if we sold our own child? Parents who want the best for their family," Roberto shouted, standing up. "Do you think I want to do this? Do you think this isn't killing me inside?" The sound of footsteps interrupted their argument. Lucia appeared at the kitchen door, her eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Roberto and Mariana looked at each other, the weight of their secret crushing them. "Nothing, honey. Mariana tried to lie. We're just, discussing finances. But Lucia wasn't fooled. She looked at her father, then at her mother, connecting the dots. It's about those people, isn't it? The ones with the card? Roberto slumped back into a chair, defeated. Lucia, there are things you wouldn't understand. I'm not a child, Papa, she interrupted, her voice trembling. Tell me the truth. Please. Mariana looked at Roberto, silently pleading with him not to. But he knew there was no turning back now. They want to buy Juanito, he finally said, the words burning his throat. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucia stared at them, hoping it was all a cruel joke. But seeing the expressions on their faces, she knew it was true. No, she said, backing away. No, you can't do that. He's my little brother. Lucia, listen. Roberto tried to explain. It's a lot of money. I don't care about the money, she cried, tears streaming down her face. You can't sell Juanito. I won't let you. She ran towards the room where the baby slept, as if afraid someone might take him away at any moment. Mariana turned to Roberto, her eyes filled with pain and disappointment. See what you've done? How could you even consider this? And what do you suggest we do? He retorted, frustration and guilt mingling in his voice. Keep living like this? Watch our children suffer day after day. We'll find another way, Mariana insisted. There's always another way. What way, Mariana? What is this other way? I've been looking for work for months. Nobody wants to hire someone like me. Then I'll look, she said. I can clean houses, babysit, anything. But we will not sell our son. Never. Roberto looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. Part of him admired her strength, her unwavering maternal love. But another part, a dark part that grew with each day of desperation, wondered if love would be enough to survive. Give me a week, he finally said. 1 week to find another solution? If I don't... He left the sentence hanging, unable to finish it. Mariana nodded, even though the thought of even considering selling her child made her stomach churn. 1 week. But promise me you won't talk to those people again. Promise me, Roberto. He nodded, though deep down, he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The following days were a whirlwind of desperate activity. Roberto scoured the city, knocking on every door, talking to every contact he ever had. Mariana started offering her services as a cleaner and babysitter in the neighborhood. Lucia, still reeling from the revelation, became fiercely protective of Juanito, barely letting him out of her sight, as if afraid someone might snatch him away at any moment. One evening, as Roberto was walking home after another fruitless day, he bumped into Don Esteban, the owner of the corner store. Roberto, my boy, the old man called out. How are things? Roberto tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. Surviving, Don Esteban, as always. The old man eyed him with concern. You look tired, son. Still looking for work? Roberto nodded. Day and night. But it seems nobody wants to hire someone like me. Don Esteban scratched his chin thoughtfully. You know, I've been thinking about hiring someone to help me out at the store. These old bones aren't what they used to be. Roberto's heart skipped a beat. Really, Don Esteban? I could, It's not much, the old man interrupted. Barely minimum wage, but it's honest work. Roberto felt like he could cry with relief. Don Esteban, you don't know what this means to me, to my family. The old man smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. You're a good man, Roberto. You just needed a chance. You start tomorrow. That night, Roberto rushed home, eager to share the good news with his family. But when he arrived, he found Mariana crying in the kitchen. What happened? He asked, fear clenching his chest. Mariana looked up, her eyes red and swollen. It's Juanito. He's sick. He has a high fever, and he won't stop crying. Roberto felt like he had been punched in the gut. Why? Since when? This afternoon, she replied. I thought it would pass, but he's getting worse. He needs a doctor, Roberto said. The joy over his new job vanished in an instant. A doctor. Something they couldn't afford. We'll take him to the public hospital, he said, trying to sound confident. Mariana shook her head. I already called. There's a wait of hours. What if it's something serious? The unspoken word hung between them, too terrible to be uttered. Roberto glanced toward the room where Lucia was caring for her little brother. He could hear the baby's faint cries, mingled with his sister's comforting whispers. At that moment, he felt the weight of Ernesto's card in his pocket. He had kept it, unable to completely discard it. "Mariana," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "there's a way." She looked at him, immediately understanding. "No, Roberto, we can't. It's for his own good." "It's for his good," he insisted, tears threatening to fall. "If he's sick, they could give him the best medical care. They could save him." "What if he's not that sick?" Mariana retorted. "What if he recovers in a few days? We will have sold our son for nothing." Roberto ran his hands through his hair in despair. "What if he doesn't recover? What if it gets worse and there's nothing we can do? Could you live with that, Mariana?" Juanito's cries intensified, as if the baby could sense his parents' anguish. Mariana looked towards the room, then back at Roberto. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the agonizing pain of an impossible decision. "One night," she finally said, her voice breaking. "We'll wait one night. If he doesn't get better, if he gets worse." Roberto nodded, unable to speak. He knew what that meant. He knew they were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to make a decision that would change their lives forever. That night, neither of them slept. They took turns caring for Juanito, applying cool cloths, trying to get him to drink water, silently praying for a miracle. Lucia, exhausted, finally fell asleep in a chair beside the crib. Roberto covered her with a blanket, feeling a pang of guilt as he thought about how this decision would affect her too. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, Roberto and Mariana looked at each other, the weight of the night etched on their tired faces. "What now?" Mariana asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roberto looked at Juanito, who was finally sleeping, though his breathing was still labored and his forehead burned. "Now," he said, pulling out Ernesto's card, "we do what we have to do to save our son." With trembling hands, he dialed the number. Each ring felt like an eternity. "Hello?" Ernesto's voice sounded surprisingly awake for being so early. Roberto closed his eyes, gathering his strength. "It's Roberto. About your offer. We accept." The silence in the waiting room of the private hospital was deafening. Roberto stared at his hands, unable to look up. Beside him, Mariana sobbed quietly, her body shaking with each ragged breath. "Mr. and Mrs. Mendoza?" a nurse called out, breaking the tension. "The doctor will see you now." They stood up mechanically, following the nurse down a spotless hallway. Roberto couldn't help but notice how different this place was from the public hospital they were used to. Everything here gleamed. It smelled clean, expensive. The doctor greeted them with a professional smile. "Please have a seat. How is our little one doing?" How is our son?" Mariana asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor looked at them seriously. "Juanito's fever was caused by a severe bacterial infection. If you had waited one more day." He let the sentence hang in the air, but the message was clear. Roberto felt like he had been punched in the gut. "But he'll be all right?" Mariana insisted, clinging to hope. The doctor nodded. "Thanks to quick intervention and the latest generation antibiotics we were able to administer, Juanito will make a full recovery. However, he'll need to stay under observation for a few more days." Roberto and Mariana exchanged a look, a moment of shared relief amidst their torment. "Thank you, doctor," Roberto said, his voice hoarse. "Can we see him?" "Of course. The nurse will take you to his room." As they walked towards Juanito's room, Roberto couldn't help but think about the cost of it all, a cost that went far beyond money. Juanito was sleeping peacefully in a hospital crib, surrounded by machines that monitored his vital signs. Mariana rushed to his side, gently stroking his head. "My baby," she whispered through her tears. "My little one." Roberto stood at the doorway, unable to approach. Guilt consumed him. They had saved their son, but at what price? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ernesto entered, his suit impeccable, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital environment. "Roberto, Mariana," he greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Glad to see little Juanito is doing better." Mariana visibly tensed, clutching Juanito closer. "What are you doing here?" Ernesto held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Just came to make sure everything was in order. After all, we have an agreement." Roberto stepped forward, placing himself between Ernesto and his family. "The deal was that we would have time to say goodbye." Of course," Ernesto nodded. "Just wanted to let you know that the family is eager to meet their new son. As soon as the doctor discharges him, we'll be here to pick him up." "Pick him up?" Mariana's voice cracked. "You talk about him like he's a package." Ernesto looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Mrs. Mendoza, I understand this is difficult, but remember you agreed to this, for Juanito's own good." "To hell with the agreement," Mariana shouted, startling Juanito, who started to cry. "You can't take our son from us." Roberto took her by the shoulders, trying to calm her down. "Mariana, please. You'll make things worse." Ernesto watched them coldly. "I suggest you calm down. Remember, this hospital, Juanito's treatment, it's all courtesy of the family who has generously decided to adopt him. You wouldn't want to appear ungrateful, would you?" With those words, he left the room, leaving Roberto and Mariana in a silence broken only by Juanito's cries. "What have we done?" Roberto sobbed. How could we even consider this?" Mariana said, rocking the baby. Roberto slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "We had no choice, Mariana. He would have died if we hadn't." "There's always another choice," she cried. "We should have trusted that we would find a way. Now we're going to lose our son." The silence that followed was deafening. Roberto knew she was right. In their desperation, they had made a decision that would haunt them forever. "We have to leave," he said suddenly, standing up. "Now, before they come back." Mariana stared at him, surprised. "What? What are you talking about? We can't let them take Juanito." "We have to run," Roberto explained, his mind racing. "Far away from here where they can't find us." "But what about Lucia? Our home?" Roberto took her hands. "Lucia will come with us. As for our home, Mariana, our home is wherever our family is together." Mariana looked at Juanito, then at Roberto. Slowly she nodded. "All right, but how? We have no money. Nowhere to go." "Leave that to me," Roberto said, kissing her forehead. "Stay here with Juanito. I'll go get Lucia and get everything ready. I'll be back tonight and we'll leave." With one last glance at his son, Roberto left the hospital, his mind a whirlwind of plans and fears. Meanwhile, at the Mendoza's modest home, Lucia anxiously awaited news of her parents and baby brother. The sound of the door opening startled her. "Mama? Papa?" she called out, running towards the entrance. She stopped short, seeing her father alone, a look on his face she had never seen before. "Papa, what's wrong? Where's Juanito? My mama?" Roberto embraced her tightly. "They're fine, my girl. Juanito is better, but we have to leave." Lucia pulled away, confused. "Leave? Leave to where?" "Far away from here," Roberto replied, quickly moving to her room. "Quickly, sweetheart. Pack only the essentials. We have to leave tonight." "But Papa, I don't understand. Why do we have to leave? What's going on?" Roberto paused, looking at his daughter with a mixture of guilt and determination. "Lucia, your mother and we made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we're going to fix it. I promise you." Lucia stared at him, connecting the dots in her mind. "It's because of those people, isn't it? The ones who wanted to buy Juanito?" Roberto nodded, unable to lie to her. "Yes, my love. But we're not going to let them take him. That's why we have to leave." "And where will we go?" Lucia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know yet," Roberto admitted, "but we'll be together. That's all that matters." While Lucia packed, Roberto frantically searched the house for anything of value they could sell. He found his mother's old wedding ring, tucked away in a box at the back of a closet. With a sigh of regret, he slipped it into his pocket. An hour later, father and daughter slipped out of the house. Mariana shook her head. "No, Roberto, we can't. It's for his own good," she insisted. "It's for his own good," Roberto insisted, tears welling up in his eyes. "If he's sick, they could give him the best medical care. They could save him." "What if he's not that sick?" Mariana countered. "What if he recovers in a few days? We'll have sold our son for nothing." Roberto ran a hand through his hair in desperation. "And what if he doesn't recover? What if it gets worse and we can't do anything? Could you live with that, Mariana? Juanito's cries intensified, as if sensing his parents' despair. Mariana looked towards the room where Lucia was with him, then back at Roberto. In his eyes, she saw the terrible struggle of an impossible decision. One night, she conceded, her voice breaking, we'll wait one night. If he doesn't get better, if it gets worse. Roberto nodded, unable to speak. He knew what this meant. They were standing on the precipice of a decision that would change their lives forever. That night, neither of them slept. They took turns caring for Juanito, applying cool cloths, trying to get him to drink water, praying silently for a miracle. Exhausted, Lucia finally fell asleep in a chair next to the crib. Roberto covered her with a blanket, a pang of guilt twisting in his gut as he thought about how this choice would affect her too. When the first rays of dawn peeked through the window, Roberto and Mariana looked at each other, the weight of the long night evident on their faces. What now? Mariana whispered. Roberto looked at Juanito. He was finally sleeping, though his breathing was still labored and his forehead felt hot. Now, he said, taking Ernesto's card from his pocket. We do what we have to do to save our son. With trembling hands, he dialed the number. Each ring felt like an eternity. Hello? Ernesto's voice, surprisingly alert, answered. Roberto closed his eyes, steeling himself. It's Roberto. About your offer. We accept. The silence in the private hospital's waiting room pressed down on them. Roberto stared at his hands, unable to meet Mariana's gaze. Beside him, she wept silently, her body racked with sobs. Mr. and Mrs. Mendoza? A nurse called out, breaking the tension. The doctor will see you now. Numbly, they followed the nurse down a pristine hallway. Roberto was struck by the contrast between this hospital and the public one they usually frequented. Here everything gleamed, smelling of antiseptic and wealth. The doctor greeted them with a professional smile. Please, have a seat. How is our little one doing? How is our son? Mariana choked out. The doctor's expression was serious. Juanito's fever was the result of a serious bacterial infection. If you had waited one more day, he began, but didn't finish the sentence. The message was clear. Roberto's stomach twisted. But he'll be all right, right? Mariana pleaded, desperate for reassurance. The doctor nodded. Thanks to quick intervention and the latest generation antibiotics, Juanito will make a full recovery. However, he'll need to stay under observation for a few more days. Roberto and Mariana exchanged a look. Relief, however, fleeting, amidst the anguish. Thank you, doctor, Roberto croaked. Can we see him? Of course. The nurse will show you to his room. As they followed the nurse, Roberto couldn't escape the thought of what this was costing them. The price they were paying went far beyond money. Juanito was sleeping soundly in a hospital crib, surrounded by machines monitoring his vitals. Mariana rushed to his side, gently stroking his tiny head. My baby, she murmured through her tears. My little one. Roberto hovered in the doorway, unable to move closer. Guilt consumed him. They had saved their son, but what had it cost them? A knock at the door startled him. Ernesto entered, his impeccable suit jarring against the sterile hospital room. Roberto, Mariana, he said, a smile playing on his lips, but not in his eyes. Glad to see little Juanito is doing better. Mariana's body tensed, and she pulled Juanito closer. What are you doing here? She demanded. Ernesto held up his hands. Just came to make sure everything was in order. After all, we have an agreement. Roberto stepped between Ernesto and his family. The deal was we would have time to say goodbye. Of course, Ernesto agreed smoothly. Just wanted to let you know that the family is eager to meet their new son. As soon as the doctor discharges him, we'll be here to pick him up. Pick him up? Mariana's voice trembled. You're talking about him like he's a package. Ernesto's lips curled into a sneer. Mrs. Mendoza, I understand this is difficult, but remember, you agreed to this, for Juanito's own good. To hell with the agreement, Mariana yelled, making Juanito stir and begin to cry. You can't take our son from us. Roberto put his arms around her, trying to soothe her. Mariana, please. You'll just make things worse. Ernesto watched them with cold eyes. I suggest you calm down. Remember, this hospital, Juanito's treatment, It's all courtesy of the family who has generously decided to adopt him. You wouldn't want to seem ungrateful, would you? With that parting shot, he left the room, leaving Roberto and Mariana in a silence broken only by Juanito's cries. "What have we done?" Roberto choked out. How could we even consider this?" Mariana cried, rocking the baby in her arms. Roberto collapsed in a chair, burying his face in his hands. "We had no choice, Mariana. He would have died." "There's always a choice," she sobbed. "We should have believed we could find a way. Now we're going to lose our son." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Roberto knew she was right. In their desperation, they had made a choice that would haunt them forever. "We have to go," Roberto declared, scrambling to his feet. "Now, before they come back." Mariana stared at him. "What are you talking about? We can't just let them take Juanito." "We have to run," Roberto insisted, his mind spinning. "Far away, where they can't find us." "What about Lucia? Our home?" Roberto grasped her hands. "Lucia will come with us. As for home, Mariana, home is wherever our family is." Mariana looked from Juanito to Roberto, and slowly she nodded. "All right, but how? We have no money, nowhere to go." "Leave that to me," he said, kissing her forehead. "You stay here with Juanito. I'll go get Lucia and make arrangements. I'll be back tonight, and we'll leave." With one final look at his son, Roberto left the hospital, fear and a desperate hope churning in his gut. Back at the Mendoza's modest home, Lucia anxiously awaited news. The sound of the front door opening sent her rushing to greet her parents. "Mama! Papa!" she called. But it was only Roberto standing in the doorway, his face a mask of tension and urgency. "Papa, what is it? Where's Juanito? Mama?" Roberto pulled her into a fierce hug. "They're fine, mija. Juanito is better. But we have to leave." Confused, Lucia pulled back. "Leave? Where are we going?" "Far away from here," Roberto replied, already moving towards her room. "Quickly, pack only what you need. We have to leave tonight." "Papa, I don't understand. Why do we have to leave? What's happening?" Roberto stopped, fixing his daughter with a look of mingled pain and resolve. "Lucia, your mama and we made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we're going to fix it, I promise." Lucia stared at him, the pieces clicking into place in her mind. "It's those people, isn't it? The ones who wanted to buy Juanito?" Roberto nodded, unable to lie. "Yes, mija. But we're not going to let them take him. That's why we have to leave." "Where will we go?" Lucia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know yet," Roberto admitted, "but we'll be together. That's all that matters." While Lucia packed a bag, Roberto frantically searched the house for anything they could sell to get them by. In a box at the back of a closet, he found his mother's old wedding ring. With a pang of sadness, he pocketed it. An hour later, father and daughter slipped out of the house, carrying only 2 backpacks filled with essentials. Roberto took one last look at the home they had built with so much love and sacrifice. "Ready?" he asked Lucia, taking her hand. "Ready, Papa," she whispered, squeezing his hand. They walked to the bus station where Roberto sold his mother's ring to a pawnbroker for a fraction of its worth. With the money, he bought 2 tickets to the furthest city they could afford. As they waited for the bus, Lucia looked up at her father. "Papa, do you think they'll find us?" Roberto pulled her close, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "No, mija. We're going far away and we're going to start over. Everything will be all right." The bus ride was long and tense. Roberto couldn't sleep, his mind going over the chain of events that led them to this desperate flight. Lucia, exhausted, dozed fitfully against his shoulder. Finally, they reached their destination, a coastal city on the other side of the country. Roberto gently nudged Lucia awake. "Come on, mija. We're here." They stepped off the bus, the salty sea air washing over them. In any other circumstance, it might have felt like the exciting start of a vacation. Now it marked the beginning of a desperate escape. "What now, Papa?" Lucia asked, looking around with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Roberto pulled out his phone, dialing the hospital number. "Now we go get your mama and Juanito." After several tries, he finally got through to Mariana. "Roberto, where are you?" Her voice was strained with fear. "We're safe," he said, trying to calm her. "Listen, Mariana, you need to get out of there, right now. Take Juanito and get to the bus station. I'll text you the address. Roberto, how? They're watching the room. Ernesto has men at every exit. Roberto squeezed his eyes shut, cursing silently. There had to be a way. Mariana, if you don't get out of there now, we'll lose Juanito forever. Silence stretched out on the other end of the line. Then Mariana's voice, resolute now. Okay, I'll find a way. I love you, Mariana. And I love you. Be careful. Roberto hung up, his heart pounding with anxiety. What is it, Papa? Lucia asked, sensing his tension. Roberto tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Your mama and Juanito will be here soon. We just have to be patient. Back at the hospital, Mariana frantically looked for a way out. Juanito slept in her arms, oblivious to the unfolding drama. A nurse entered the room. Mrs. Mendoza, do you need anything? Mariana seized the opportunity. Yes, I need to use the bathroom. Could you watch Juanito for a moment? The nurse hesitated for a second, but then nodded. Of course, no problem. As soon as the nurse turned away, Mariana clutched Juanito to her chest and ran toward the emergency stairs. Alarms blared behind her as she raced down the steps, her heart hammering in her chest. On the first floor, she pushed open the emergency exit and found herself in an alley behind the hospital. Without a second thought, she ran towards the main street. Footsteps pounded behind her. She heard shouts of her name. Taxi! She cried desperately, waving her free hand. A taxi screeched to a halt in front of her. Mariana threw herself inside, gasping for breath. Bus station! Please, hurry! The driver, taking in her frantic state, nodded and sped off. Mariana glanced out the back window, seeing Ernesto's men spilling onto the street, frantically searching for her. Juanito started to cry, startled by the commotion. Shh, mi amor, she soothed, rocking him gently. Everything will be okay. We're going to see Papa and Lucia. The journey to the bus station felt interminable. Every red light, every stop, was agonizing. Mariana constantly checked the rearview mirror, terrified of seeing Ernesto's cars. Finally, the taxi pulled up to the station. Mariana paid with the little money she had and hurried out, clutching Juanito close. Mariana! Roberto's voice cut through the crowds. She turned, relief flooding her as she saw her husband and Lucia running towards them. For a moment, all the fear and anguish faded away. They were together. Roberto wrapped them in a desperate embrace. Thank God, you're safe! Lucia joined the hug, tears streaming down her face. Mama, Juanito, I missed you both so much. No time for this, Mariana interrupted, glancing around nervously. We have to go. Ready, Roberto? Ready. He grabbed one of the backpacks. Come on, our bus leaves in 10 minutes. As they hurried towards the platform, Lucia couldn't help asking, Where are we going? Far away, Roberto replied. Very far from here. They boarded the bus just as it was about to depart. As they settled into their seats, Mariana spotted several men in suits entering the station, their eyes scanning the crowds. Roberto, she whispered, discreetly pointing. He followed her gaze and cursed under his breath. Get down, everyone! Don't let them see us! The family huddled in their seats, holding their breath as the bus slowly pulled away. They passed within feet of Ernesto's men, close enough to touch, if they had reached out, but they remained unseen. The bus exited the station and merged onto the highway. Only when the city was far behind them did the Mendozas allow themselves to breathe again. We made it, Mariana murmured, hugging Juanito close. Roberto nodded, but his expression remained grim. For now, but we can't let our guard down. Lucia looked at them, the weight of their situation settling on her small shoulders. What are we going to do now? Where will we go? Roberto took her hand, trying to offer reassurance. I have an old friend on the coast. We'll stay with him while we figure things out. The journey took hours. Juanito, oblivious to the drama, slept peacefully in Mariana's arms. Lucia alternated between dozing and staring out the window, watching the landscape gradually shift from city to countryside, and finally to the coast. When they reached their destination, the sun was rising. The small coastal town looked like something out of a postcard, with brightly colored houses and the constant, soothing rhythm of the sea. Is this where your friend lives? Mariana asked as they got off the bus. Roberto nodded, adjusting his backpack. Yes, Miguel. We worked together years ago before I moved to the city. They walked along cobblestone streets, The salty air a welcome change after the long bus ride. Finally, they stopped in front of a small blue house with an overgrown garden. Roberto took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Tense moments passed before the door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with a thick gray beard. "Roberto!" The man blinked, surprised. "Is that you?" "Miguel." Roberto greeted him with a tired smile. "It's been a while." Miguel's eyes flickered over the family, taking in their weary faces and the baby in Mariana's arms. His expression softened with understanding. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" Roberto nodded, shame and relief warring within him. We need a place to stay, just for a while." Miguel didn't hesitate. He swung the door wide, stepping aside. "Come in. Mi casa es su casa." Once inside, Miguel showed them to a small room at the back of the house. It wasn't much, but to the Mendozas, it was a sanctuary. "Get some rest," Miguel said. "We'll talk when you've had some sleep." Exhausted, they settled in as best they could. Mariana and Juanito on the bed, Roberto in an old armchair, and Lucia on an inflatable mattress Miguel provided. But despite their weariness, sleep wouldn't come easily. The adrenaline from their flight was still coursing through their veins, and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on their hearts. "Roberto," Mariana whispered in the darkness. "What are we going to do?" He turned towards her, seeing the outline of her face in the dim light. "I don't know, mi amor, but we're together. We'll figure something out." Lucia, also unable to sleep, sat up. "Papa, will we stay here forever?" Roberto sighed. "I don't know, mija. For now, this is the safest place for us. What about school and my friends?" The question hung in the air, a painful reminder of all they had left behind. "I'm sorry, Lucia," Mariana said, her voice breaking. "I know this is hard for you." "It's okay, Mama," Lucia replied, trying to sound brave. "The important thing is that we're together, right?" Roberto felt his heart clench with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His daughter was showing a strength he was struggling to find within himself. "That's right, mija," Roberto agreed. "And I promise you, no matter what happens, we'll stay together." Exhaustion finally claimed them, and they drifted into a restless sleep. Hours later, the sound of pounding on the door jolted them awake. "Roberto!" Miguel's voice was urgent. "I need you to see something." Heart hammering, Roberto stumbled out of bed and opened the door. Miguel stood there holding a local newspaper. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the front page. Roberto's blood ran cold as he saw their photos splashed across the headlines. "Family wanted for child abduction." "No," he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. Mariana rushed over, reading over his shoulder. Her face turned white. How can they accuse us of kidnapping our own son?" Miguel's expression was grim. "They have connections, money. They can make any lie seem like the truth." Lucia, also awake now, stared at the paper in horror. "What are we going to do?" Roberto dropped the paper, his mind racing. "We have to go. It's not safe here anymore." "But where?" Mariana asked, clutching Juanito protectively. "I know someone who might be able to help," Miguel interjected. "A lawyer in the capital. If you can prove Juanito is your son—" "How are we going to get there?" Roberto interrupted. "We have no money, and now they're looking for us." Miguel smiled faintly. "I have an old boat. It's not much, but it'll take you down the coast to a port where they won't be looking. From there, you can catch a bus to the capital." Roberto looked at his friend, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Miguel, I can't ask you to do this. You've already done so much." Miguel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not asking, amigo. I'm offering. Besides," he added with a wry grin, "I've always wanted to be a bit of a pirate." Despite the gravity of the situation, everyone laughed, a moment of release from the mounting tension. "Thank you," Roberto said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll never forget this." "Don't mention it," Miguel replied. "Now get ready. We'll leave at nightfall." As the Mendozas packed their meager belongings, Lucia approached her father. "Papa," she asked quietly, "do you think we'll ever be able to go home again?" Roberto looked at her, seeing fear and hope mingled in her young eyes. "I don't know, mija, but I promise you, no matter what, we'll make a new home. Together." Lucia nodded, hugging him tightly. Meanwhile, Mariana was feeding Juanito, her mind racing with worry. "Roberto," she said softly, "what if we can't prove Juanito is ours? What if they take him away from us? Roberto sat beside her. We won't let that happen. We'll fight, Mariana, with everything we have. She nodded, silent tears running down her cheeks. I'm scared, she confessed. Me too, he admitted, putting his arm around her. But we have to be strong. For them. As the sun began to set, the Mendozas prepared for their next challenge. Miguel led them through back alleys to a small dock where his boat was moored. It's not much, he said, gesturing towards the weathered vessel, but it'll get you where you need to go. Roberto eyed the boat apprehensively. Are you sure it's safe? Miguel laughed. I've been sailing this thing for years, trust me. As they loaded their meager possessions, Lucia looked out at the horizon, where the sun was sinking into the sea in a blaze of color. It's beautiful, she murmured. Mariana put an arm around her shoulders. It is, and someday, when all of this is over, we'll watch sunsets like this again. As a family, finally everything was ready. Miguel gave them final instructions and a rough map. Follow the coastline south. In a few hours, you'll reach a small fishing village. You can catch a bus to the capital from there without raising suspicion. Roberto embraced his friend. Miguel, I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by staying alive and keeping your family together, Miguel interrupted. With one last hug and words of gratitude, the Mendozas boarded the boat. Roberto started the engine, which coughed and sputtered before roaring to life. As they pulled away from the dock, Lucia looked back, seeing Miguel waving goodbye. The reality of their situation hit her once more. Do you think we'll ever see him again? She asked. Mariana hugged her close. I hope so, mi amor. Someday. As the shoreline receded and night fell around them, the Mendozas sailed into the unknown. The gentle rocking of the boat and the rhythmic sound of the waves were both comforting and terrifying. Roberto kept a steady hand on the tiller, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Mariana sat close, Juanito sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Lucia huddled under a blanket, fighting the chill of the sea air. How long do you think it will take? Mariana asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the motor. Roberto consulted the map by the dim light of a flashlight. If the wind holds, we should reach the village before dawn. The journey was long and tense. Every light in the distance, every unusual sound, made them fear they had been discovered. But the hours passed without incident, and slowly the tension began to ease. Lucia, unable to sleep, wandered to the bow of the boat. Papa, look, she said, pointing to the sky. I've never seen so many stars. Roberto smiled, allowing himself a moment of peace. That's because we're far from the city lights, mija. Out here, we can see the sky as it really is. Mariana joined them, Juanito still sleeping in her arms. For a while, the four of them stood in silence, contemplating the vastness of the starlit sky. It's as if the universe is telling us there's hope, Mariana murmured. Roberto nodded, pulling her close. There is, mi amor. As long as we're together, there's always hope. As the night wore on, exhaustion took hold. Lucia finally fell asleep, curled up next to her mother. Roberto fought to keep his eyes open, the gentle rocking of the boat tempting him to close them. It was Mariana who saw it first. Roberto, look, she said, pointing ahead. In the distance, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, they could make out the lights of a small coastal town. The small boat gently bobbed as Roberto secured it to the weathered dock of the fishing village. Dawn was just beginning to paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, casting a soft glow on the deserted streets. Wake up, Roberto whispered, gently shaking Mariana and Lucia. We're here. Mariana's eyes fluttered open, and she clutched Juanito closer. Where are we? I don't know exactly, Roberto replied, helping her out of the boat. But according to Miguel's directions, we should be able to catch a bus to the capital from here. Lucia, still sleepy, looked around curiously. This place looks sad. She wasn't wrong. The small coastal town, with its salt-worn houses and narrow streets, had an air of neglect that hung heavy in the air. Come on, Roberto said, shouldering the backpacks. We need to find the bus station before anyone recognizes us. They walked in silence through the deserted streets, the only sounds the distant cries of seagulls and the rhythmic lapping of waves. Suddenly, a gravelly voice startled them. Looking for something? They turned to see an old man sitting on the porch of a nearby house, smoking a pipe. Trying to remain calm, Roberto replied, "Yes, the bus station. Could you tell us where it is?" The old man eyed them suspiciously, his gaze lingering on Juanito. "Aren't you the ones from the news? The ones who kidnapped that baby?" Roberto's heart pounded. Mariana clutched Juanito tighter, while Lucia hid behind her father. "No," Roberto said, trying to sound convincing. "You must be mistaking us for someone else. We're just a family of tourists." The old man didn't look convinced. Well, the station is at the end of this street on the right. But if I were you, I'd be careful. The police are looking for a family that looks just like yours." "Thank you for the warning," Roberto said, quickly moving away. "We'll be careful." Once out of earshot, Mariana whispered, "Roberto, what are we going to do? Even in this tiny town, they recognize us." "Calm down," he reassured her, though his voice shook slightly. "We'll get to the capital and find a lawyer. Everything will be cleared up." "What if they catch us?" Lucia asked, tears welling up in her eyes. "Papa, Mama, will they separate us?" Roberto stopped, kneeling in front of his daughter. "Listen to me, Lucia. I won't let anything bad happen to you, to any of you. I promise." They finally reached the tiny bus station, which was little more than a wooden shack with a faded sign. A sleepy-looking man manned the ticket window. "Good morning," Roberto said, trying to sound casual. "When does the next bus to the capital leave?" The man consulted a wrinkled timetable. "In an hour." "4 tickets, please," Roberto said, pulling out the remaining money they had. While they waited, the family sat on a rickety bench, trying not to attract attention. Mariana fed Juanito, covering him with a blanket to shield him from curious eyes. Suddenly, the sound of a siren in the distance made them jump. "Do you think—" Mariana began. "Don't think about it," Roberto interrupted. "It probably has nothing to do with us." But as the sound drew closer, their anxiety grew. Lucia clutched her father's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Papa," she whispered, "I'm scared." Roberto tried to smile, though he felt like his heart was about to burst. "Everything will be okay, sweetheart. Just—" He couldn't finish the sentence. A police car swung around the corner, heading straight for the station. "Quick!" Roberto shouted, leaping to his feet and pulling his family towards a bus that had just pulled in. Without waiting for it to fully stop, they scrambled aboard. Roberto practically threw the money at the driver. "Go, please!" The driver, startled by their urgency, obeyed. The bus lurched forward just as the police car screeched to a halt in front of the station. Through the rear window, they watched as 2 officers emerged from the car, looking confused as the bus sped away. "That was close," Mariana murmured, her voice shaking. Roberto nodded, speechless. Adrenaline surged through him, and for a moment he thought his heart would stop. The journey to the capital was fraught with tension. Every time the bus stopped, they held their breath, terrified that the police would board, searching for them. But the hours passed without incident. Finally, the skyscrapers of the capital appeared on the horizon. "What now, Papa?" Lucia asked as they disembarked from the bus. Roberto looked around, feeling lost in the vast city. Now we find that lawyer Miguel mentioned." They walked along busy streets feeling exposed and vulnerable. Every glance felt accusatory. Every siren in the distance was a threat. Finally, after asking for directions at several offices, they found themselves in front of a modest law firm in the city center. The nameplate on the door read, "Dr. Alejandro Vega, family lawyer." Roberto took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," a voice called from inside. They entered to find a middle-aged man with graying hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He looked at them curiously. "Can I help you?" Summoning his courage, Roberto replied, "Dr. Vega, we need your help. We're the family from the news, the ones accused of kidnapping." The lawyer froze, processing this information. Then slowly he removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "I see," he said finally. "Please, have a seat and tell me everything. From the beginning." For the next hour, Roberto and Mariana recounted their story, from Juanito's illness to their desperate escape. Dr. Vega listened intently, making occasional notes. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Your situation is complicated, to say the least, but not impossible. Can you help us?" Mariana asked, a flicker of hope in her voice. Dr. Vega nodded slowly. "I can try, But you must understand, this will not be easy. The family that tried to adopt your son has resources, connections. It will be an uphill battle. We'll do whatever it takes, Roberto said firmly. We just, we just want this to be over, to be able to live in peace with our children. The lawyer regarded them sympathetically. I understand, but before we can proceed, I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything else I need to know? Anything that might make this more difficult? Roberto and Mariana exchanged a look. The moment of truth had arrived. Yes, Roberto admitted, his voice a bare whisper. I took money from them. In the beginning. Dr. Vega closed his eyes as if warding off a sudden headache. That complicates things considerably. What can we do? Mariana asked, close to tears. The lawyer stood, walking towards the window. First, we need to establish, without a doubt, that Juanito is your biological son. That means DNA tests. And then, he continued as Roberto started to interject, we need to build a solid case, demonstrate that you acted under duress, that you feared for your son's life. It will be difficult, but not impossible. Lucia, who had been quiet throughout, spoke up. Will we be able to go home someday? The lawyer looked at her kindly. I hope so, little one, but it will take time. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled them. Dr. Vega's secretary entered, her face pale. Doctor, the police are here. They're asking for them. She gestured towards the Mendozas. Panic gripped the room. Mariana clutched Juanito close, while Lucia clung to Roberto. Stay calm, doctor, Vega said, his voice firm. Let me talk to them. He exited the office, shutting the door behind him. The minutes that followed were the longest of the Mendozas' lives. They could hear muffled voices from the other side of the door, but they couldn't make out the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Vega returned. His expression was grave. The good news is, I managed to convince them not to arrest you. For now, he said. The bad news is, you'll have to report to the police station tomorrow morning to give your statements. Will they separate us? Mariana asked, her voice breaking. The lawyer shook his head. Not if I can help it, but you need to understand, this is serious. From now on, every word, every action will be crucial. Roberto nodded, feeling more weary than he ever had in his life. What do we do now? Now, Dr. Vega said, I'm taking you somewhere safe. A shelter for families in crisis situations. You'll be protected there while we work on your case. As they left the office, escorted by Dr. Vega, Roberto couldn't escape the feeling that they were walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything they were fighting for would come crashing down. The shelter turned out to be an old but well-maintained building on the outskirts of the city. A maternal-looking woman greeted them at the entrance. Welcome, she said, offering a warm smile. I'm Sister Maria. You'll be safe here. As she led them to their room, Lucia tugged on her father's sleeve. Papa, this is like being in prison. Roberto knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. No, sweetheart. It's a refuge. A place where we can be together and safe while we fix things. The room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a crib for Juanito. Mariana let out a sigh of relief as she saw the crib. At least he'll be able to sleep comfortably, she murmured, laying the sleeping baby down. None of them slept well that night. The anxiety of what awaited them the next day kept them tossing and turning. The following morning, Dr. Vega arrived early to prepare them for their statements. Remember, he said as they headed to the police station, tell the truth, but be careful with your words. Don't offer more information than necessary. As they stepped into the police station, Roberto felt like he was entering the lion's den. Officers eyed them with suspicion. He spotted a news report playing on a TV in the corner, their photos flashing on the screen. They were led to separate interrogation rooms. Roberto felt his heart clench as he watched Mariana and Lucia being taken in different directions. Everything will be okay, he called after them, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I love you. In the interrogation room, Roberto faced 2 stern-looking detectives. Mr. Mendoza, one of them began. Do you know why you're here? Roberto nodded, his mouth dry. Yes, but it's not what you think. We didn't kidnap anyone. Juanito is our son. The detective cocked his head. Then perhaps you can explain why you ran, why you didn't go to the authorities. As you say, all of this is a misunderstanding. Roberto closed his eyes, remembering Dr. Vega's advice. Be careful with your words. We were scared, he finally answered. Juanito was sick, very sick. We needed money for his treatment, and we made a mistake. But when they wanted to keep him, we couldn't bear it. He's our son. A mistake? The detective leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Mr. Mendoza, accepting money in exchange for a child is more than a mistake. It's a crime. Roberto felt sweat trickling down his back. I know, and I regret it deeply. But you have to understand, we were desperate. The other detective, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Tell us about Ernesto. How did you meet him? Roberto took a deep breath, recalling that fateful night at the bar. It was a coincidence. I was at a bar, letting off steam, and he approached me. He said he represented a wealthy family who wanted to adopt. And you didn't find that suspicious? Of course I did, Roberto admitted. But at that moment, with Juanito so sick, we just saw it as a way out. Meanwhile, in another room, Mariana was facing her own interrogation. Mrs. Mendoza, the detective, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, began. We understand this is a difficult situation, but we need you to be completely honest with us. Mariana nodded, clutching Juanito close. I will. I just want this to be over. Tell us about the night you ran from the hospital. Why did you do it? Mariana closed her eyes, remembering the fear and desperation of that night. Ernesto, the man who offered us the money. He came to the hospital room, Mariana said, her voice shaking. He said they would take Juanito as soon as he was discharged. We couldn't let that happen. He's our son. The detective pointed a finger at her. But you had accepted the money. I know, Mariana said, tears rolling down her cheeks. It was a terrible mistake. But when Juanito got so sick, we realized that no amount of money was worth our son's life. In a third room, Lucia sat across from a social worker. Unlike her parents' interrogations, the atmosphere here was less intimidating. Toys and coloring books were scattered on the table. Lucia, the social worker began in a gentle voice, can you tell me a little about your family? What are your parents like with you and your little brother? Lucia looked down at the drawing she was making, a picture of her family together. They're the best parents in the world, she said with conviction. Papa always tries to make us laugh, even when things are bad. And Mama hugs us tight and tells us everything will be all right. And how do you feel about everything that's happened lately? It must have been very confusing for you. Tears welled up in Lucia's eyes. It was. It still is. But I know Papa and Mama only wanted what was best for us. They're not bad people, I promise. The social worker smiled understandingly. I believe you, Lucia. One last question. If you could make a wish right now, what would it be? Without hesitation, Lucia replied, that we could all be together again, at home, that all of this would just end. After hours of interrogation, the Mendozas were reunited in a waiting room. Dr. Vega was there, his face professionally concerned. How did it go? He asked quietly. Exhausted, Roberto replied. We did what we could. We told the truth. The lawyer nodded. Good. Now we wait. The prosecutor will decide whether to press charges. What if they do? Mariana asked, fear lacing her voice. Then we fight, Dr. Vega answered resolutely. We have a solid case. You acted under duress, in fear for your son's life. That counts for a lot. Suddenly the door swung open, and a man in an expensive suit entered, followed by Ernesto. Roberto shot to his feet, placing himself protectively in front of his family. What's he doing here? He growled. Ignoring Roberto, the suited man addressed Dr. Vega. I'm the Valdezis' attorney. We're prepared to offer a settlement. Dr. Vega frowned. What kind of settlement? One that benefits all parties, the lawyer replied, a smile playing on his lips but not in his eyes. The Valdezis will drop all charges and lawsuits against the Mendozas. In return, they want shared custody of the child. A stunned silence fell over the room. Never, Mariana burst out, clutching Juanito tightly. He's our son. The Valdez's attorney sighed dramatically. Mrs. Mendoza, be reasonable. If this goes to trial, you could lose everything. Custody, your freedom. Is that what you want? Roberto looked at his family, then at Dr. Vega, seeking guidance. The lawyer met his gaze, his expression grave. Roberto, he said quietly, the decision is yours, but you need to consider all your options. Lucia, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. But, Papa, Mama, don't let them take Juanito, please. Roberto felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. He looked at Mariana, seeing the same conflict mirrored in her eyes. Then he looked at Juanito, sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. Finally, Roberto turned to the Valdez's attorney, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Number, we don't accept. Juanito is our son, and we'll fight for him. The Valdez's attorney frowned. You're making a grave mistake. We're offering you a way out. The only way out we want, Mariana interjected, is to go home with our children, all of us together. Ernesto, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Roberto, Mariana, think carefully. You know you can't give Juanito the life he deserves. With the Valdez's, he might have everything, except his real family, Lucia countered, surprising everyone with the firmness in her voice. Money isn't everything. Dr. Vega, seeing the situation escalating, intervened. I believe we're done here. My clients have made their decision. If there's nothing further, we'll be taking our leave. The Valdez's attorney glared at them with a mixture of frustration and contempt. Very well. We'll see you in court then. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. With that, he and Ernesto swept out of the room, leaving behind a tense silence. Roberto slumped back into his chair, the weight of their decision pressing down on him. Did we do the right thing? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. Dr. Vega placed a hand on his shoulder. You did what you thought was best for your family, and I will support you every step of the way. Mariana moved to stand beside Roberto, Juanito still in her arms. We're in this together, mi amor. No matter what happens. Lucia joined the family embrace. I love you, Papa, Mama. Thank you for not giving up. As the Mendozas held each other close, Dr. Vega watched with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew the road ahead would be a difficult one, fraught with legal and emotional challenges. But he also knew that this family's love and determination would be their greatest strength. All right, he said finally, breaking the moment. Now the real work begins. We have to prepare for trial. The following days were a blur of activity as Dr. Vega worked tirelessly to build their defense. The Mendozas submitted to DNA testing to prove Juanito's parentage. One afternoon, as they were reviewing documents at the shelter, Mariana voiced the question they had all been dreading. What happens if we lose? Dr. Vega looked at her seriously. I won't lie to you. If we lose, the consequences could be severe. You could lose custody of Juanito, and there's a possibility you could face criminal charges. Roberto squeezed Mariana's hand. We can't think like that. We have to believe we will win. Roberto is right, the lawyer agreed. Our case is strong. We have the DNA evidence, testimony from neighbors regarding your financial situation, even Juanito's medical records, which show how serious his condition was. All of this supports our claim that you acted under duress and desperation. Lucia, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. What if I talk at the trial? I can tell everyone that they are good parents. Dr. Vega smiled gently at her. That could help, Lucia. But first, we need to see if the judge will allow it. Sometimes they prefer to shield children from the pressure of testifying. As they continued discussing how to best incorporate Miguel's testimony into their defense, Mariana noticed Juanito becoming restless. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby. Suddenly, Juanito let out a giggle, his first real laugh since this whole nightmare began. The sound was like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds, lighting up the faces of everyone in the room. Juanito's laughter seemed to break the tension. For a moment, everyone forgot their worries and smiled at the baby. That's the first time I've heard him laugh like that since this all started, Mariana said, tears in her eyes. Roberto moved closer, stroking his son's head. It's like he knows things are going to get better. Dr. Vega watched them, a mix of tenderness and determination in his eyes. And they will. I'll make sure of it. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Dr. Vega worked tirelessly, refining their defense strategy. Miguel gave his official statement, corroborating the Mendoza's story. The night before the trial, no one could sleep. Roberto found Lucia sitting by the window of the shelter, staring at the stars. "Can't sleep, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting beside her. Lucia shook her head. "I'm scared, Papa. What if they separate us?" Roberto hugged her tightly. "Listen to me, Lucia. No matter what happens tomorrow, we will always be a family. Nothing can change that. Promise?" "Promise." The next morning, the Mendozas, dressed in the best clothes they could find. Dr. Vega met them outside the courthouse. "Remember," he said as they ascended the steps, "tell the truth, but be careful. Let me handle the difficult questions." As they entered the courtroom, Roberto felt his heart pounding in his chest. On one side sat the Valdezes, with their expensive suits and confident expressions. On the other sat his small family, united but fearful. The judge, a stern-faced man, entered the courtroom. "Let's begin," he said, striking his gavel. The prosecutor was the first to present his case. He painted the Mendozas as irresponsible parents who had tried to sell their son for money. "These individuals," he said, pointing at Roberto and Mariana, "put an innocent baby's life in danger out of sheer greed." When it was Dr. Vega's turn, he rose calmly. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of irresponsible parents, but a desperate family who made a mistake and then did everything in their power to correct it." He called Roberto to the stand first. "Mr. Mendoza," he began, "tell us about the night you met Ernesto." Roberto took a deep breath. I was desperate. Juanito was very sick, and we didn't have the money for his treatment. When Ernesto came to us with his offer, for a moment, it seemed like the only way out." "And what made you change your mind?" "Seeing my son in that hospital bed," Roberto replied, his voice breaking. "I realized no amount of money could replace the love of a family." The prosecutor rose to cross-examine. "Mr. Mendoza, isn't it true that you accepted money in exchange for your son?" Roberto lowered his head. "Yeah, I did. And it's been the biggest mistake of my life, one that I've been trying to fix ever since." Mariana took the stand next. She spoke of her fear of losing Juanito, the desperation that led them to consider Ernesto's offer. "When I realized what it really meant," she said, tears streaming down her face, "I knew I couldn't go through with it. Juanito is our son, not something to be bought or sold." Miguel's testimony was particularly powerful. He described how Roberto and Mariana had come to him, terrified and remorseful. "These weren't criminals," he said. "I saw parents desperate to protect their family." Finally, to everyone's surprise, the judge allowed Lucia to testify. "Lucia," Dr. Vega said gently, "can you tell us what your parents are like?" Lucia looked at Roberto and Mariana, then at the judge. "My parents are the best in the world. They always take care of us, love us, even when things are hard. I know they made a mistake, but they did it because they thought it was the only way to save Juanito." Roberto's heart swelled with pride and sorrow, hearing his daughter's words. After all the testimonies had been presented, the judge retired to deliberate. The hours of waiting were agonizing for the Mendozas. Finally, the judge returned. The courtroom fell silent as he prepared to deliver his verdict. "This case," he began, "has been one of the most difficult I've ever faced. On the one hand, we have parents who, in a moment of desperation, considered an unthinkable act. On the other, we have a family that has fought tirelessly to stay together." Roberto squeezed Mariana's hand, holding his breath. "Having considered all the evidence," the judge continued, "I have reached the conclusion that, while the Mendozas did commit a grave error, their subsequent actions demonstrate genuine remorse and an unwavering love for their children." Roberto's heart pounded so loudly, he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "Therefore," the judge declared, I rule that Juanito Mendoza shall remain in the custody of his biological parents, Roberto and Mariana Mendoza. A sob of relief escaped from Mariana's lips. Lucia jumped up, hugging her parents tightly. However, the judge continued, given the seriousness of the initial actions, I order that the Mendozas be subject to supervision by social services for a period of 1 year to ensure the well-being of the children. Roberto nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. It was a small price to pay for keeping his family together. Case closed, the judge concluded, striking his gavel. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of emotions. Dr. Vega embraced the family, tears of joy in his eyes. We did it! You're safe! As they left the courthouse, Roberto paused for a moment, looking at his family. Mariana held a giggling, squirming Juanito, while Lucia skipped ahead, chattering excitedly about going home. In that moment, Roberto knew that despite everything they had endured, the future was bright. They had made mistakes, yes, but they had also learned valuable lessons about love, family, and what truly matters in life. Let's go home, he said, taking Lucia's hand and putting his arm around Mariana. As they walked towards their new life, Roberto made a silent promise. Never again would he allow desperation to cloud his judgment. His family was his true wealth, and he would protect them with everything he had. The sun shone down on them, a promise of better days to come. The Mendozas had walked through fire and emerged stronger, more united. And though they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, they were ready to face it, together.